G'day everybody, David Wilson here, coming to you from Mount Evelyn on behalf of Zach's Place, the community church started up by the God Squad Yarra Valley chapter. And it's great, a bit of a shout out today to Ollie, who is in the UK South chapter of God Squad. He written to me a couple of times, wrote to me last week after viewing last week's message, encouraging us and telling us that he hopes to be with us one day over here in Australia, but also telling me of a project that they've got going there that they're hoping to get into after the COVID stuff is over, and how encouraging the Nehemiah message was to that project. So it's great, isn't it, to be able to share with one another around Zach's Place over the technology that we have, but also to know that message and that sharing is going even further into our brothers and sisters over there in the UK, in the God Squad UK South chapter. So shout out to everybody over there, and thanks for being a part of what we're doing here. All the best to you. We've been talking about Nehemiah over the last few weeks. Remember, Nehemiah is headed back to Jerusalem, and he has all the resources that he needs to rebuild the walls and get stuck into a renewal in the city. Remember, the Jews had been carted off by Babylon into exile, and then Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon, and they were still exiles. And Nehemiah finds himself up in Susa, which is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, and learns that things in Jerusalem are not good. The exile is coming to an end and people are returning, the Jews are returning, but things are not good back in Jerusalem. The people and the place are suffering. And so Nehemiah has permission to go back and to lead a team to start renewing the city. And that's where we pick up the story today. Nehemiah chapter 3. We'll if you want to stop the video and have a read of that chapter, it's a bit lengthy and a bit sort of detailish and so forth. Have a bit of a skim of it and see what you're picking up from chapter 3, and then turn back on the video, and we'll have a bit of a look at it. So, amongst all the details of the project that we see there in Nehemiah chapter 3, and all of the labourers that were involved in it, we find some very interesting things that would be good to note, that are important principles for any community involvement that we might have as the church in our neighbourhoods, for Zach's Place, as we're involved in the Yarra Valley, and working for community building, because that's what God wants us to be involved in, and building up the church as a community of the kingdom. There's some really interesting principles here in this passage. A bit hard to read because of all the details that are there, but let's have a look at some of the principles that are there in this chapter. For instance, we noticed that there were high-ranked officials. There were political and religious officials. There were academics, and there were craftsmen, and they're all involved in the manual labour. Everybody's becoming involved, except for a few people who were nobles from Tekoa, who thought that they were above such work, and that came out in verse 5. But apart from them, everybody seems to be involved. Political and religious leaders, academics, craftsmen, everybody's involved in this manual labour. It's really good to see. Another principle that came out in the chapter is, after building their sections, they dedicated the work to God. They constantly remembered God as they were going on and building these things. Also, the parts of the walls and the gates that they are building are often the parts that are closest to their own homes. Not everybody's from Jerusalem, so that wasn't always the case, but it does mention a number of times that the parts of the walls and the gates that they were involved in were closest to their own homes. Interesting point. Some people were from surrounding towns, and they came in and worked on the gates and the walls as well. There's a lot of teamwork going on here with people from all over the place and from all sorts of trades and occupations. There were goldsmiths and silversmiths as well as tradies and so forth. And women were included as well. It wasn't just a male thing, it was a male and female thing. And so the women were included. And also we note that some of the walls and the gates that needed to be rebuilt or repaired, because there's a lot of repair going on as well as actual rebuilding. But some parts needed extra work than other parts did. They were even more destroyed. The destruction was greater, and so extra people were assigned to those parts of the walls and the gates. Well, that's sort of the stuff that came out of that. But in reflecting on it, I think it will help us to see some of these principles that are for us today. For instance, it's obvious that good organisation of a project is necessary. This is God's work, and God is at work getting these things done. But that doesn't excuse us for poor planning or for poor organisation. It's God's work that is being done through human agency, and it needs to be well organised. And that's how it is with the church. The church is involved in God's work in the neighbourhood, in the community around us, and it is God's work. But God wants us to be wise in doing it. God wants us to think through how to do it. He wants it to be well organised and well planned. And certainly it was with Nehemiah. It's exceptional as we read through this chapter. We noticed that it was a lay project. It wasn't just something that the hierarchy or the professional labourers or anything were involved in. They didn't hire professional builders. Sometimes we would sit back today and sort of get professionals to do this or professionals to do that. It wasn't that at all. It was a whole of community project. It was a whole of neighbourhood project. They were the ones who were doing the work. Everybody pitched in, no matter what their occupations were. And that's really important for us as the church involved in the neighbourhood, for us to recognise that community rebuilding, getting out there and getting stuck into making this the neighbourhood the best place it could possibly be, is going to involve everybody, people of faith and people who are not yet have faith, and all types of people. Everybody brings something to the table, and that's one of the great principles of what we call community development. The task is shared by everyone. The whole community is involved. And those nobles of Tekoa who stood back and thought, this is too low for us, well, they're an anti-model. They're people who are not good examples of what everybody else was doing. And so I guess every community has to have some, but they're not a good part of the scene here in Nehemiah chapter 3. Stopping and dedicating the work that they'd done, I think that's really important, to be mindful of God and thankful to Him right throughout the project is an important thing. Sometimes we might get into a project, pray beforehand, go ahead and spend months or whatever it might be fulfilling the project, and then afterwards, bless it to God. But it seems every section, all the way through the project, they were dedicating it to God. They were mindful this is God's work. And I think that's really important for us in any project, in any community project that we're involved in any church project that we're involved in, to be constantly reminded that this is God's work. Seeking His advice, seeking His face, and praising Him and dedicating our work to Him on a constant basis is, I think, an important principle that comes out of this chapter. It's interesting that they all had their own sections to work on, because I think that's part of what motivated them. People are motivated when they see the benefit that they're going to get from the project. And that's just human nature. If I can see that I'm going to get benefit from this project, I will do it. So when we're involved in the neighbourhood, helping people to see the benefit to themselves is really important. However, I would say that it's hoped that we will move beyond that and be motivated by seeing other people benefit from it. It's human nature to say, am I going to benefit from it? Yes, I will. Then I'll really put myself into this. That's just the way it is. But it's really nice when you see in the church and in the neighbourhood people being motivated by the fact that other people are going to benefit from this, not just me. And that's why I'm intrigued with some of the builders on the wall and the gates. Were actually from villages outside of Jerusalem. Now, there would have been benefit to them, but not the same as the people who were living inside of Jerusalem. And what motivated them? Well, maybe they came to the table. Maybe they came to work because they had grown to that point of seeing, or of being motivated by other people benefiting from the work that they were doing. That's what I would long for. For instance, in Zach's place, let's not be just motivated by what it is to benefit us. For instance, sometimes in the church we might say, oh, we're really motivated to do this project in the neighbourhood because it might see bums on seats, or it might get dollars in offerings and that sort of stuff. I haven't experienced that at Zach's place, but you can easily fall into that trap. And we need to be those who are motivated by this is doing benefit to our neighbourhood. This is doing benefit to the community around us, and in that God is being blessed. God is pleased with that sort of motivation. The task could have been overwhelming. I can just imagine Nehemiah sitting back and looking at the walls. After he did his inspection, which we talked about last week, looking at the walls. How are we going? Where do we start? And that's how it oftentimes is in our neighbourhood. You look at a project that you're involved in, and you think, where do we start? Where do we start with this? And it could have been overwhelming, but each group of people had an area of responsibility with good division of labour, and that's a very good principle in any project that we've got. To divide the task up, and to help people take responsibility for their own parts of the project. Is a good way to cause an overwhelming project to become seen as manageable. Very important principle. One of the things that I noticed is there's no room for competitiveness. They weren't competing with one another. They had opposition, and we'll find out more about that in another chapter. But they had no room for competitiveness. The teams of people around the wall, on the gates and so forth, were working together. There was partnership. Well, there's no room for competitiveness in community work. One of the things that I'm deeply involved in the homelessness scene and have been for decades. And one of the things that kills mission to homelessness is competitiveness between the agencies that are working on it. They need to partner together. They need to network together. They need to work together to see homelessness being properly addressed sustainably. But when there's competitiveness, it just gets in the way. And we see that with church all over the place. Local churches competing with each other because for their own benefits and so forth. And it's just not the way to get community work done. It's not the way to see the kingdom come to earth, as Jesus said we should pray for. Things will get done through partnerships and through teamwork. We all have something to bring to the table, and that's a really important point. Nehemiah knew it, and that's something for us to remember. It's also interesting to note, that some parts needed more work and more labourers. In our community projects, that's true. There will be some aspects that are harder to work through, that are harder to work on. They'll need extra effort and extra resources, and sometimes this can be perceived as inequality. How come we're not getting as much as that part of the project that's going on? But the reality of good project management is to recognise how much labour and how much money and how much work is to be put into every piece of the scene of the project, of what's going on, and important to manage the project in that sort of way. Does this line up with Jesus' words? Does it line up with his mission? Well, in many ways, Jesus was on a mission of community renewal. His mission wasn't to rebuild Jerusalem, but it was to rebuild God's community, God's kingdom. In the creation of the church, the ecclesia of God, this was his mission. And as such, he had a well-planned and organised project. It was all planned out from the beginning, from before time began, we're told in the scriptures. And the prophets foretold it piece by piece in every detail. And John the Baptist prepared the way for it. There was plenty of opposition and plenty of non-involvement, but the project was completed with his death, his resurrection, and his ascension, and then the sending of the Spirit. The creation of the church, as we see from Acts onwards, was the fulfillment of that mission, that community building mission that Jesus had. In so many ways, the principles that Nehemiah had were principles that Jesus fulfilled as well. So how does that apply to us today? Well, God left that church with a project, a mission to fulfill. It's a dual project. It's a dual project of building the kingdom, building the community of the church, the ecclesia, and being God's people, being God's community in the neighbourhood. And we're called to both of those projects, both of those missions. And we have a lot to do. And I think that there's a lot of principles that are here in this chapter of Nehemiah 3 that are applicable to the things that we're called to do in both building the community of the church as well as in reaching out to the neighbourhood around us. Both of those things are very important, and both of those things can be benefited by the sort of principles that we've been talking about here in Nehemiah 3. You know, I guess it's a challenge to all of us at Zach's Place and beyond, when we're able to get back together after this COVID-19 stuff, and we're able to look around at the community and say, how can we be a community church? How can we benefit the neighbourhood of Yarra Junction and beyond, across the Yarra Valley? That we'll be mindful of the principles that are here being talked about, mindful of these principles, and say, how can we apply these to the project that God has called us to? It's going to be exciting. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great to get together and reconsider those sorts of things. So I hope you have a great week, and look forward to sharing with you again from Nehemiah 4 next week. God bless.